Thank you so much for your time and attention and for joining us today. If you are here for the LGBTQIA transgender training, you're in the right room. If you're here for other training, then you've missed it. You have to stay anyway. My name is Clinton Normore. I'm Director of Diversity here at ATSU. And as soon as I learned that I would be training on this topic, I engaged my colleague, our colleague, Art Matthews, to help me because he is topic specific in this area. So we are going to tag team our discussion today. We appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, and if you have any questions during the presentation, by all means raise your hands or shout out loud. We take any and all questions, but we will have some opportunity to interact with regard to clicker and questions. So here we go. The objectives, what we want you to gain out of this is a meaning of LGBTQ, and IA is not on there. The evolution of the communities. The transgender education, which is specific in terms of the content of this particular training, how our co-proficiency model meshes with the LGBTQ communities, our commitment as a university to those communities. We want to touch on our diversity statement and our mission statement as well, because they all espouse the value of these communities in our environment. What we have here is our diversity framework as a university. This is something that's new, and it is derived from our task to be preeminent, from our board of trustees and our university president. You all know that preeminence is something that's very hard to attain. I actually think that it's something that you never attain, that you're always working towards. So we're always engaged in that work towards preeminence. Our framework suggests that we have 6 different pillars that are important to lead us to that idea of preeminence, i.e. The idea of diversity. My philosophy is there are 2 perspectives of diversity. There's the idea of diversity, and there's the actual practice of diversity. The idea is what we say. We want to be a diverse community. We have diverse representation with regard to our marketing materials. We espouse the idea of difference and value that difference by our conversations. The practice of it is we are what we say, i.e. we have a very diverse group of employees, students, and staff in our environment. And we'll get into the construct of diversity with regard to difference a little bit later. What we're dealing with in our framework now are utilizing our internal resources to create educational opportunity toward that end, toward preeminence, towards diversity. This cannot be achieved without paying particular attention to our core, our value, our belief systems. That, in essence, leads us to our mission statement. It helps us develop a mission statement and a vision statement. And with planning, strategic planning, then we can utilize that framework to achieve ultimately the practice of diversity and preeminence.
Okay. This is only, well, more like a 45-minute training, so I can't really go through this whole history, but never before in the world have we been able to conceptualize sexual orientation and gender identity the way we can today. But we do know that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people have existed throughout history, throughout cultures. And since the 19th century, we kind of see some of the highlights here. 1920s, gay culture flourished as part of the Harlem Renaissance. The Mattachine Society in the 1950s was founded. We also have the Daughters of Bilitis in 1955. The big turning point is probably the 1969 Stonewall riots, where gay, lesbian, and some transgender people stood up against police harassment and abuse. We have the 1980s, the increased national awareness related to the AIDS epidemic. If the AIDS epidemic did anything good, I guess that's what it did, to help shine a light on groups of people. We have Ellen DeGeneres coming out on national television. We have the Vermont Supreme Court, well, the ruling by the Supreme Court in Vermont that made same-sex unions must be treated equally as marriage, And then we have the 2004 Massachusetts Supreme Court, the ruling in the Supreme Court about Massachusetts and the marriage equality. I'm standing too far away. From a trans history, there's really not much evidence before 1950s of someone being fully transitioned. We have Christine Jorgensen in 1952, who was a soldier who then transitioned from male to female and became a socialite. We have, it's really impossible for me to read because it's so blurry, but we have other people that you might recognize here. We have Dr. Renee Richards, who transitioned in the 1970s, tennis pro. We have Chaz Bono, transitioned in the last 10 years. We have Tanya Mock, who is, I believe, has worked on MTV and in popular culture. So we have a lot of different people that have transitioned. And these are kind of the people that we go to when we go, well, what's a transgender look like? Because they've been in the public eye. And so people's concepts might be folks like this, or it might be drag queens, people that perform as the other gender, which I'll get into later, may not indicate a trans identity. So deconstructing the alphabet, we have the LGBTQA, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, questioning, allied, or asexual. I don't think I need to tell you what each one of those are. But then we have gender identity, we have trans and intersex. And we get into the distinction between what is sex and what is gender. Sex is when you were born, somebody looked at you and said, external sexual characteristics, male or female, one of two boxes. The binary, the gender binary, you fit in one of those. So sex is usually what's on your birth certificate. Gender is a concept of who I am. That's my identity, what I see myself to be. And that is where we have an interplay of physiology, genetics, and identity here. Transgendered, transsexual. Then we have cross-dressing, which we used to use the term transvestite. It's kind of a derogatory term, as is homosexual. That's pretty clinical. So those terms have kind of been removed. Intersexed is a person who's born with ambiguous genitalia, anatomy typical of a male or female, or aspects of both. Atypical, sorry, not typical. And again, we'll get into some of the reasons why that happens, but this is a fairly common thing, 1 in 1,000 births. The infant may be ambiguous as to gender or sex. The trans identity, we have an external sex characteristics do not match how they identify their gender. We have transsexual, which would be someone who's fully transitioned. Again, they don't tend to use the word transsexual. They usually use the word something like trans man or a trans woman, with the last word being what their identity is now, not where they started. And when they're transitioned, usually there's some aspect of gender realignment surgery or sex realignment surgery. We have cross-dresser, and a cross-dresser may not indicate transgender identity, as I mentioned earlier. We have a lady here. Does anybody know who this is? I'm too old to know popular culture anymore. She's some sort of actress or famous person, I'm sure. But is she cross-dressing? Yes or no? Yeah, kind of, maybe. Well, probably cross-dressing for fashion or for statement. There's other reasons why. Comfort, a disguise or a personator or a performer or an illusionist. And then sexual fetishism. These are those folks that their sexual stimulation gets transferred to an inanimate object. So could be shoes, could be underwear of the opposite gender. And they typically are pretty stealth. They're under the radar. They don't want you to know that they're wearing someone else's panties. They just want you to be about your business. Part of the thrill for them might be that, hey, I'm doing something and you don't know what I'm doing. But again, a fairly small group of people. So what do we call him? What's this? Scottish, thank you. So, here we also have something else, which is culture, what's appropriate in a culture or in a society, that when you take that person out of that culture or society and into another one, may not be considered appropriate or interesting. Well, not interesting, appropriate. We had a student from Samoa who came to school one day and was dressed in a Samoan sarong, I guess. Kind of looked like a skirt. And some people were a little confused by that. Like, he's not dressing as a woman, that's his dress. That's the way they dress at home. We come to intersex, the ambiguous genitalia. Male and female sex organs come from the same tissue. It just depends on what you were exposed to in womb, how that develops. So a male fetus that's exposed to estrogens will develop a feminizing effect and a masculizing effect on a female fetus. So a male fetus, the testicles may not descend, the scrotum will not be fully formed, the penis may be small. Well, what's that look like? Anybody that's had a girl? The vagina and labia, maybe. Maybe a little larger. Same thing with the masculinizing effect on a female fetus. The clitoris is pronounced. The labias are larger. And that could confuse some people into thinking they've just had a boy. Genetic impact, we have a missing or an extra sex chromosome that can cause ambiguous external sex characteristics. We have Klinefelters, the XXY, trisomy X, diplomy Y, and then Turner syndrome. And the photographs I have here are of a man who identifies as male, who has Klinefelters. But if you saw this on a genetic report, so is that male or is that female? We have pronounced breast tissue. They can be sterile. They maybe have smaller junk in the trunk. Well, not in the trunk, but in the front. And then with Turner syndrome, you have just one sex chromosome. We have a very straight structure, not a female curves, no hips. These people are about the same age. Some myths about trans people. They live crazy lives. Well, if we go back to that slide where we showed you the people that are typically on the forefront, the ones on the newspaper pages or in entertainment, I can understand why people might think that. Because every bit of somebody's life now, if you're famous, is on TV or in a magazine. So it might look like a pretty crazy life. But a lot of the common transgender people just want to pick up their kids from laundry or daycare, go pick up the laundry, go grocery shopping, go to the dentist. Transgender people are confused. This is one of the things that they're probably not once they settle on their identity. They know their gender, but they're confusing to everybody else because they're going through a process of transitioning, or you kind of look like you have characteristics of this, but you look like you might have that. Again, we like that gender binary as a species. Transgender people are mentally disturbed. Well, anyone who's a group of an underserved or an oppressed class has higher levels of stress and therefore may be more susceptible to mental illnesses. But they are not mentally ill just because of their gender identity. Transgender people are gay. Some are gay, some are not gay. Some are gay before they transition, some are gay after they transition. Gender identity and sexual orientation are separate concepts. Who I see myself to be and who I'm attracted to. Transgender people are people with radical viewpoints and ideas. Again, those folks that showed up on that timeline, those are people that are out there. They're championing. They are being advocates for themselves and other people. So they may appear to be people with radical viewpoints. Transgender people hate their bodies. No. Many of them want to enhance their bodies. They want to change their bodies in some way. Is there anybody in this room who does not want to change something about their body? Okay. Transgender people perform in drag shows. Some people who are transgender perform in drag shows, but they typically have a persona that they perform as, and then they have their identity that they go home with. That may be the same gender, but it may be not. You can tell someone's transgender just by looking at them. I have a slide coming up for that. Transgender people aren't real men or women. Who gets to determine real? Transgender people are weird. So what would you think if one of these people came into the workplace? Which one of them is trans? Any guesses? A, show of hands. B, C, and D. All of them. All of these people are transgender. Cisgender privilege. We can't talk about transgender people if we don't talk about cisgender. What is cisgender? Well, if we talk about gay and lesbian, the opposite of that is heterosexual, right? So cisgender means that your birth certificate sex matches your identity of who you are. So a cisgendered person knows they are male or female, and that matches their external genitalia and their birth certificate. So there's privilege that goes along with being cisgendered. You don't have to convince your parents of your true gender or have to re-earn their love and respect. You don't have to remind your extended family over and over again which pronoun to use when referring to you. My name is Gina. I'm a her. Yes, Jean, I remember. You don't have to deal with old photographs that don't reflect who you truly are. And you don't have to, on a job application, explain why this set of experience might be under one name, it's male, and this is a different name and female. You can use public restrooms, locker rooms, and store changing rooms without fear of being considered a pervert. You don't need to worry about going places on a whim because there will always be a bathroom you can use. Unless you're going out, like hiking, in which case none of us have one. Can blend in without being stared at, whispered at, pointed at, or laughed at. Strangers can call you by the name you provide and don't ask your real name. Get a job, an apartment, or a loan. You can flirt, engage in courtship, or form a relationship without fear that your assigned gender may cause rejection or violence because your partner questions their sexual orientation. You can assume your gender is represented on medical forms. Gender binary, what do we do? Are you male or are you female? How about, how do you identify your gender? Blank. You expect that your gender will not prevent you from receiving an appropriate treatment or that your health problems stem from your gender identity. You can assume that you will not be diagnosed with a mental pathology just because of your gender. Cisgender people can assume they will not be profiled on the street as a sex worker. You can assume that if you have a crime committed against you, your gender expression will not be used as a justification. Why? To defend the perpetrator's action. One of the famous people on that transgender timeline is a woman who was involved in a car accident. I believe it was in Los Angeles. It was in need of emergency care. The EMT came, started to perform CPR also had to take some of the clothes and pull them off because there were broken bones. And as they did so, they understood that the bottom and the top didn't match. And the EMT refused to do anything, and that person died. You can easily find role models and mentors who emulate that share your identity. You can assume everyone you encounter will understand your identity, not think you're confused, misled, or going to hell. You can assume that you will not be denied services. So, a few tips for you. I know this is really kind of a rush because we got a lot to do. Don't think you can tell by looking, because as you already realized, you can't. You may run across transgender people every day, and they look just like everybody else. But those few folks that have difficulty passing, or they have a characteristic that stands out, they may not necessarily be transgender. I like to reflect back to my great-great-aunt Daisy, who had an Adam's apple and a hairy chin. So, listen to transgender people. Don't make assumptions about orientation, which is sexual orientation, rather than gender identity. If you don't know what pronouns to use, ask, how should I refer to you? Respect confidentiality. Avoid backhanded compliments or helpful tips. Someone who says, you know, I didn't at first know, but I can tell now. And you're doing a great job. You know, thanks. You know. Be patient with those exploring their gender identity. They may not know what to call themselves yet. They may not know how they want to fully express their gender. Respect the terminology they use. Don't ask what their real name is. Don't ask about surgical status. Just because somebody is transitioning does not mean they're going to do the full Monty. Challenge anti-transgender remarks. Support a gender-neutral public restroom. And set a transgender-inclusive tone. And this is a test he's come up with, if you can read that.
Actually, this is really a link, and it's a link to training. It's a quiz. It takes about 20 minutes. We're not going to do it because it takes too long, but it's at the University of California, San Francisco, and you'll have access to this information. I encourage you to take it because it is very, very informative. We'll do that, hopefully give you the opportunity that these resources a little bit later. What I do want you to do is take a few minutes to review this video, and then we'll engage in some conversation following.
Excited to hear that the theme of this year's conference is We Count. I think that means a lot of things, certainly to me. One is just it speaks to the need to reduce the invisibility and the isolation that a lot of transgender people have.
Being counted means that I exist. Being counted means that I'm a part of the picture. There's a climate of change happening, and I'd like for me as a trans person and the rest of the trans community to be counted in this era of change.
Nosotros contamos significa que nosotros podemos contar como cualquier comunidad, tenemos los mismos derechos y podemos tener los mismos beneficios que cualquier otra persona.
To me, it means having an input everywhere that we possibly can.
We count would be honoring am no longer invisible, that our voice can be heard. We're not just pushed aside. And, you know, that I've noticed that I am part of the community.
Being counted comes with a recognition of the community as a specific group of people with specific needs.
No soy discriminada, ser apoyada, si tengo algún problema, que pueda ir y sentirme cómoda.
I think we count in this voicing that we're out there, and it's time to recognize us and to include our population.
To me, being counted means that my opinion matters, that my contributions to society, to community matters.
We are not counted in the census, we're not on a lot of the national health surveys, so it's really difficult for us to show that we do numerically count. And we've got to find a way to better document our existence and the many needs that we have in our community to make sure that those needs are met.
In our native tradition, they say that we're just like everybody else on this earth. You know, trying to live our lives as prosperous and happy as we could. That's what I think we count means to me.
Para mí igualdad significa que nosotros como transgéneros no podemos ser diferentes que cualquier otra comunidad, porque nosotros somos humanos también y tenemos que tener la misma igualdad en todo, ya sea en lo legal, en cualquier aspecto, tenemos que tener la misma igualdad.
I believe that transgender people, transgender individuals should be treated equally, not specially, not differently, but equally, just like any other people.
Equality is like just making sure you always have your basic needs met. And what I mean by that is even human needs, just like going to the bathroom can be really a really hard thing for trans people. And that's such a basic human need. Everybody has to keep it.
I think equality means that I have the same rights to any other person. I have the same rights to employment. I have the same rights to housing. I have the same rights to present myself as my true self without being slaughtered or murdered or held or being laughed at.
Equality means that my rights aren't being overlooked as a transgender woman. That I can get a job, that I can get the same benefits, that I can get rights to health benefits.
For me, equality means that transgender people have the full access to the opportunities that any other American faces. That we have good access to jobs, to good access to schools, to families, to healthcare, and to the basic services that we need.
And freedom just to go out like on the street just like anybody else. And if there's a couple walking hand in hand, so I can walk with my boyfriend down the street holding hands, just singing our life into our life, go shopping wherever we go.
As far as employment, I know that I will be hired because of my skills and that I will not be discriminated on because of my gender.
Para mí igualdad significa ser igual a las demás gentes, a la demás sociedad, ser persona, siento, sufro, tengo necesidades y muchas veces por ser transgénero hay veces que te lo rechazan.
But for me, I'm an advocate to champions of the people, and that's how I look at life today, as being of the people, not just being separate, but being a part of the people. And they call it the lush light, five finger light, and we are all five finger light. So for me, that's equality.
As we take a moment and reflect on that video, think about, don't raise your hand, but think about how many of you, of us, watched the name scroll across the bottom and tried to identify the male version of that transgender person and attach that name, change that name to the male persona that we see that or see that person to be. That's unconscious bias. That's the bias that exists in all of us. We all have biases. The idea moving forward is to get beyond that bias and take people for who they are and who they say they are, because that is truly the value of our university. We're going to engage in a case study really quickly. We have a case study and about 3 questions that we're going to ask and discuss. This is a case study that was really specific to the clinic, but I think it relates to our environment as well because we help prepare our students to function in clinic or in healthcare professions. I'll read it. It's a 22-year-old woman enters the clinic as a first-time patient. She tells the receptionist that she has not seen a physician for over 4 years, and she would like a checkup. She is given an intake form to fill out, on which she reports that her current gender identity is female, and her sex assigned at birth was male. Her first name is Markeisha, but her identification lists a masculine first name, Mark. While she is waiting to see a physician, she enters the women's restroom. Another patient comes out of the women's restroom and reports to the receptionist that she thinks a man is using the women's restroom. The receptionist sends a medical assistant into the women's restroom to see if there is a problem. The medical assistant returns and says everything is all right. Markeisha exits the restroom and sits in the waiting area. A nurse appears with a chart and calls for Mark. Markeisha looks around sheepishly. The nurse calls again for Mark. The patient who had reported a man in the women's restroom laughs derisively. Markeisha gets up and goes to the nurse, who takes her to an exam room. Markeisha waits nervously for the physician. Now, taking that into account, moving into the first question that we have, how would you handle a restroom-related complaint, this restroom-related complaint, and you can signify as such by your clickers A, B, C, or D. Do you send a medical assistant? Do you advise the patient that there's no problem? Call police? Or do you tell the complainant that everything's okay? Okay, respondents. Send a medical assistant to check the problem. Tell the complainant that everything is okay. Now, why would we choose one of those to answer that question? Can anybody comment on that specific choice?
Well, the receptionist may not actually have known who was in the restaurant. So to send somebody to check it out would seem to prove that there was a complaint.
Absolutely. How about, yes?
I chose D because as a mother of a son, I mean, to me, it doesn't matter what restaurant you're in. If the women's restroom is crowded or full, I have been known to go into a male's restaurant to use the bathroom. And my son has come into a female restaurant to use the bathroom with me when he was too young to go alone. So to me, it doesn't matter. Toilet is a toilet. So I really compare that. We've all seen the opposite sex body parts before. If we shouldn't see it in the restaurant anyway, but so to me, it didn't make a difference.
Okay, very valid point. Brought up before. Actually, answers A and D is true, and for both reasons. First and foremost, as an institution, we're a healthcare professions education institution. So our ideology is that we prepare our society to be as culturally proficient as possible. So then we must model that same proficiency. We want to create a welcoming environment. So we want the patient, both patients, to feel affirmed by their respective ideas. But we don't want to affirm the behavior of the latter patient. So we respect the complaint of the first patient, the waiting room attendant in the restroom, by sending a medical assistant, and also respect the confidentiality and the transgender person's perspective by saying that everything is okay. And we do so in a way that all folks, all persons are privy and hear that information, so that they know that we value their existence in our society, in our community. Next, you should always address the patient by the name on the intake form. If you're working in a clinic and someone gave you a preferred name, which sometimes happen over the government name, should you address that patient by Mark, the government name, or Markeisha, their preferred name? True or false? 30 seconds.
Little confusion here. Who said false? I'm sorry, who said true? You should always do that. Why did you say that?
It's the name on the form, it's the name on the form.
But he also said it was a preferred name, so if that's what they prefer to be called, then that's what it is.
Right, and if there was a space on the form that asks for a preferred name, why would they even ask for that if they're not going to call you that?
Well, if you're a healthcare professional, you have to possibly bill insurance. So if you have to bill insurance and you're using electronic forms, everything has to go into the machine so that you get paid. And if that person hasn't transitioned legally to a new name and a new gender, and she's Mark on her driver's license and her insurance card, but she's Markeisha, you're going to have two sets of names. We have to, as healthcare professionals, identify that that person who's using these services, the person that's coming to use their insurance with us, is the real person that they say they are. And you might have a disconnect between the identity on the cards and the identity of the person. So my insurance does allow me to put in the legal name so I can bill the insurance, and it gives me a preferred name section. But it's up to me to always make sure, because if you're filing that file, it's probably going to be filed under their legal name. And some people choose to throw away all of their legal name when they're transitioning because of familial problems.
And the next question, and last question, is the clinic staff should address patients who criticize or harass transgender patients in the waiting room. So you should or should not address that person who is laughing profusely. Now, you had those who said true, you should address, and those who said false. What do you think? Why? Why wouldn't we, for what reasons would we not address someone who is harassing another patient, or at least laughing out loud? And that's okay, I completely understand.
I put false because I think that there's a time and place, and in front of everybody else is not the time and place, and maybe there's a little room off to the side, or something that you can address them quietly versus announcing it in front of everyone else and making a bigger speak for that one person.
Same with you.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I put false because you didn't give enough information.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't let us know, would you address it right there in front of that person, or are you going to address it afterwards?
Okay.
So I need more information to answer that.
Okay. That too makes sense. In the construct of the question, though, think about this. If we are a community that respects cultural proficiency in that we appreciate and value differences, then we appreciate and value all the differences. So if we have someone being belittled, demeaned in a public place, now we have a discrimination policy so that we do not allow bullying. Then it is incumbent upon us as healthcare professionals, as members of the A.T. Still University community, to address that scenario. And I agree with you that sometimes we may be reluctant to address that scenario in a public place, thinking that that is going to create more distraction than actually do any good. However, there are ways to mitigate that issue in a very professional, respectful, and courteous manner. And I would simply approach the patient who is laughing and say, "Man, we would appreciate you not treating this issue in this manner. Much like we would respect your confidentiality and your perspectives, we respect the confidentiality and the position of all of our patients. So we have a policy that does not allow us to belittle, berate, or bully, or harass others. And we would appreciate that you would adhere to our university standards and policy." Now, saying that in that manner, in that setting, affirms to this patient who was laughing profusely that that's not tolerated, and you don't demean that person. But it also lets the transgender person, Markeisha, know that this is a safe place for her to come to and seek treatment. Because at the end of the day, and I'll say this again a little bit later, at the end of the day, we are an institution that values difference, that values the idea of education, which relies on a customer-type relationship. So we are bound by our customer relationships. So therefore, if we don't encourage, enhance, and influence a good customer relationship, we no longer have customers. And we don't want to be in a position where we don't have repeat customers. That puts us in a bad business case scenario. So, and fear is prevalent. Fear is prevalent in each of us to some degree has experienced some type of fear in a large setting. Peter Gruber, famous director, denoted fear as being false expectations appearing real. And we all have those instances. And it's up to those of us, and I'll talk about dominant culture, those of us in the dominant culture to alleviate those fears. And oftentimes when we are different, actually we're all different, but when we are different externally to a room that we're immersing ourselves in or entering, we do a scan. We do an external scan. I do it all the time. I still do. I learned it as a young kid. And I know many of you do as well, to see if that's going to be a welcoming environment. And it's our subconscious, and it's instantaneous. And it sets us, prepares us to engage in that environment based on what we see. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create that welcoming environment so whoever walks into that room, our room, knows that this is a safe place for them to conduct their business or interact. So, the answer was true. What is diversity? Diversity is one of those things that no one entity or no one person has the same way of defining and can spit it out the same way every time. So let's think about that for a minute. What do you think diversity is comprised of? What is diversity to you? Monica, I know you know. I know you have some thoughts.
The fact that everybody is different, and some things are obvious and some things are not, but being able to look into yourself and exhibit the cultural humility to be able to look at yourself and into your beliefs, and then examine everybody else and be able to understand the differences of that.
Absolutely. Diversity in a nutshell is difference. That's how I always speak about it. Fact of the matter, if we are trying to be a diverse community, we must first reconcile ourselves with the fact that we are all different. And that's a starting point. Though we're different, we have some common areas of interest. And that is what we build on. We don't build on the differences. We see and value and appreciate the differences and the difference that those differences make. But we build on those commonalities that we have. Most institutions don't have a definition of diversity for those very reasons. It will be different from every perspective. But we want to create some common language to where we can talk as an institution about diversity consistently across constituent groups and into those external communities that we are part of. We have created, we being ACOD and the Advisory Council on Diversity, an idea of what the definition of diversity is. The model of cultural proficiency is a model that I learned of a few years ago, and it moves us beyond cultural competence, which is the standard bearer in healthcare professions, to cultural proficiency, and we'll talk about the rationale behind that, all leading towards preeminence. And to be culturally proficient, we created this definition rooted out of the definition of what cultural proficiency is. Now, cultural proficiency is a way of thinking, a way of being that we can respond effectively and efficiently to difference. We're all different. We'll learn how to ask questions appropriately, just like Art mentioned earlier. If you don't know, ask, and you can ask a question in a very respectful manner. If we're a clinician in an office setting, much of the information that we ask, we have to know. It's on a need-to-know basis, but when you're dealing with someone LGBTQIA or transgender person, they may not be in that place where they're willing to offer that information so readily. So then you have to fall back on your competency as far as building a relationship. You start to build a relationship with that person so that that person can trust the fact that they can divulge this very personal information to you so that you can do your job effectively. And that's what we do with regard to, or how we do it with regard to being culturally proficient or thinking culturally proficient. Now, our diversity statement has been adopted for the university and is now a part or a construct of our university materials. And it is definitive of what we think our beliefs of a culturally proficient society should be. Culturally rich, that means we know that we have a myriad of difference in all of its forms, every possible way. Differences is not just the external, and we often think about, focus on, and pay particular to counting the external differences for the sake of what measures we need with regard to federal government. But there are internal differences that exist among each of us, within our different cultural groups, within our different communities that have value. Relationship differences are one of them. Sexual orientation is certainly true. But you can't have diversity without being inclusive. Diversity and inclusivity are connected. If you're truly trying to be diverse, then you're going to be inclusive. There is the idea of diversity, and then there's the practice. The idea speaks about diversity in all its grandeur. The practice of diversity creates the processes and the systems that include others, the differences, so that we can reach the kind of environment that we hope to be. Diversity is about acceptance and appreciation. You have to agree. It doesn't say I agree with you. I accept you for all your differences, and I appreciate the value that you bring to my interaction. And at some point during our relationship building, we will meet in the middle. We may not agree, but we meet in the middle. We focus on the common areas of interest. And then being culturally proficient affirms that value, provides affirmation so that we can value our environment. Now, the model in and of itself speaks truly to those specific things that we're talking about with regard to gender and sexual orientation. And it's also a construct of just about every job description that you see talking about the value of those things. And we want to think in those terms in order to be being culturally proficient. Culture is a construct of cultural proficiency. The fact that we are in this room means that we are in a culture. We have the ATSU culture, we have the Mesa culture, we have the Kirksville culture, we have Soma culture, we have ASDO culture, we have this room culture. This culture is what it is right now, based on everybody in here. And there is a dominant force in this culture and a non-dominant force. Culture changes instantaneously. If someone leaves, our culture has just changed. The dominant force in our culture right now is Art and I, because we are talking about this transgender training. So therefore, as non-dominant culture participants, you are influenced by the dominant culture. You cannot not be influenced by dominant culture. That's what the cultural model teaches us. It teaches us to look beyond ourselves in a dominant cultural setting, because as educators, you are teaching to an audience. And when you're teaching to your audience or working with a patient, you're the dominant force in that interaction. So therefore, everyone in that culture is influenced by your perspective. And you have to understand that if you're trying to be diverse, you will be inclusive of those folks who are engaged in that culture with you. Now, our mission is predicated on a focus for diversity. That moves towards the practice. If you focus on diversity, then you're trying to achieve those systemic processes and practices that lend you to creating an environment that's completely diverse. Now, for the sake of diversity in terms of federal standards or in terms of reporting, we often look at the external. We often look at whether or not a person is African American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, or American Indian or Asian as far as reporting, and we count those numbers based on typically our national standards. And that, in a way, lends us to trying to be more diverse. But there are other ways to measure diversity also. There are gender, of course. There are also military status. There are also sexual orientation. We can utilize these markers to measure how diverse we are as an environment. But each of these markers are self-reported. So we may not have the actual numbers with regard to how diverse we are, but we're moving to preeminence. So we're always working on being a more diverse environment. The key, though, is to focus on the common areas of interest. And our common areas of interest, much like this culture, is that we are first all members of ATSU community. And probably the most important element, let me tell you what the most important element is as far as a common area of interest that we all have. What in common do we share as a group? We have something in common that goes beyond ATSU. It's right there. I see it. Say it. You won't be wrong. Educating future medical students. That's one. There's another one. We're all human. At least last time I checked, I was. We are all human beings. So based on our idea of being culturally proficient, we value the fact that we first are human. We don't see, or we see, but we don't pay particular attention to the differences that exist. We focus on the common areas. We get beyond those cultural biases, we get beyond those systemic biases, and we move to an area where we can start to learn about each other. We can start to appreciate and value the differences that we have. Perspective is a very real thing, just as perception is. That's okay, we'll take your name off. See you, Doc. So it's important for us to think about culture in terms of how do I impact, if I'm the dominant culture, how do I impact, influence, and enhance the perspective of that non-dominant culture that is in my group. When I create a culture, when I create an environment, is it reflective of the environment that I want to see, that I want to welcome into my community? When students who are transgender or African American or Latina walk into my environment, do they see other students who look like them? Do they see materials that appreciate and welcome their perspective? That has value. When I walk into a building and I'm transgender, do I see a restroom that I can go to without thinking about the ridicule and the disastrous comments that I could face as a result of walking into a quote-unquote non-gender specific to me restroom? Those are things we want to think about if we're moving towards cultural proficiency and ultimately, subsequently, becoming a preeminent environment. So this next slide is really just campus resources that we put together, and not all. It's just a handful of resources that we've gotten information from for these slides. Art has a myriad of resources. What we are doing as ACOD, or will be doing as ACOD, on our diversity web page is creating a virtual resource room so that each and every one of us, if we have a question, could hopefully navigate toward this virtual resource and find some information that might help us to answer that particular question, and then provide education tools for ourselves and others in our community. So we hope that you will visit the website, visit the diversity page often, and look for those resources and utilize them as they come online. Some takeaways: the methodology, the framework of ATSU. It's important because it's impacting the work that you do, and you impact the logistics and the structure with regard to the work that you do. Myths about LGBT community. Look beyond those myths. If you don't know, ask. If you don't know how to ask, find out how. If you don't know who to ask, find the person who can help you frame the questions and get to some resolution. The model of cultural proficiency as an institution, how it relates to the LGBT community, but more directly, how it relates to our culture, the ATSU culture, the brand that we're trying to build in order to create a welcoming environment, and then how you impact that mission. And then the cultural proficiency related to transgender persons and the members in American society, the LGBT community, with regard to cultural proficiency. We talked about the resources. Utilize those as much as you possibly can. I am always available. I'm here 1 week of every month, and Art is here all the time. You can reach us via email, which is easy, but we would also hope that you would engage and utilize those resources once we make those available to you. Are there any questions? And Art has a comment. There is a panel that is about to come up in a choir.
Dr. Larry Ratto with the SOMA program is doing a transgender discussion panel. So there will be transgender people here on Tuesday of next week from 11:30 to 1, I believe it is. And I believe it's here. So same time, same bat channel. Come back for that program on Tuesday. And what I also printed off and gave to most of you is a page for WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And on here is a very helpful standards of care that can be used by various health professionals in working with transgender people. So you can download that. That's a PDF. It may be most specific to mental health related fields because if transgender people are going to transition, they have to prove that they don't have a mental disease or disorder. But in order to do that, we have to give them one called gender dysphoria. So not the greatest thing. But you can look for that, and there's very helpful tips on how you can change clinical practice to be culturally proficient with transgender people.
Any questions? One must say thank you for your time. We enjoyed the opportunity to visit.
Thank you.